Hello gamers, and welcome back to the Big Brain Energy channel, bringing you live, unbiased coverage of the Third AI War, straight from the front lines. I'm your host, Chadicus Rex, and I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsors, Kazaron Shipyards. Remember, when you think quality, think Kazaron. Now, I've been told by reputable sources that the commanding officer of the Persean task force is one of the best in the business. His resume includes an array of highly desirable skills such as officer training, crew training, electronic warfare, and coordinated maneuvers. Unfortunately for him, the Persean League cannot manufacture some of the most desirable anti-shield weapons such as hypervelocity drivers and squalls. Given that the Remnant are highly reliant on their shields for their defenses, the lack of these premium options may prove to be their downfall. Of course, the Remnant themselves require no introduction, the antagonist of this war, a leftover weapon manufactured by Tritachyon during the First and Second AI Wars. Though official records state they were purged at the end of the Second AI War, this is proven to be false as attacks have been launched from every direction outside the core worlds. The Remnant were out there, biding their time. And here we see the Nova jumping forward, but not quite as far as one would expect from a ship of its reputation. The AI feel no fear, they feel no pain, and so they're not afraid to get in and get dirty. But for some reason, this Nova is letting the frigates live, which I'm sure the Persean crew appreciate because the Vigilance is not a durable ship. And here we can see the Persean commanding officer shifting tactics, moving the Herons into a defensive position behind the Griffins. And while the Griffin is not known for its durability, it's certainly more durable than a pure carrier like the Heron. And once again, the Nova, the most dangerous ship in this fleet, is not taking aggressive action, but in this case it may be a bad idea. This is the famous cruiser doctrine the Persean League is known for, creating a flexible battle line that is able to retreat and absorb incoming assaults before swiftly punishing the enemy that overextends by collapsing in on them from all directions. Keep in mind, while the Persean League has brought 2 battle cruisers to the Remnant's 1, in terms of total ship mass, it is the Remnants who have the advantage here. In addition to the advanced cognitive processing of their AI cores, they should have a significant advantage in this battle. Our analysts have put the odds at 1 to 1.89 in favor of the Remnant. It's not looking good for the Persean League, but so far they're holding out fairly well. For the moment, all the casualties have been on the Remnant side. So far, the weapons package of combining directed energy munitions such as Dragonfire torpedoes and Gorgons with the power of interceptors and battle cruisers has kept the automated menace at bay, but the question on everyone's mind is, can it last? Dragonfires are not known for their longevity. They are powerful, but their limited capacity means that when they run out, any ships that are relying on them are going to be in a lot of trouble. And here we can see a Vigilance just barely scrapes by. It's only got a fraction of hull. Its capacity is at maximum, but it refuses to die. It refuses to go down. And that's a Dragonfire on that Apex, but those things are durable. It's going to survive, and the Nova is in a very aggressive position. That Griffin is in danger. This is a make-or-break moment. It's all up to that Conquest pilot to put some DPS on target and keep that Griffin safe. Wow, he makes it look easy. I think that guy's in for a Medal of Honor when this is all over. What an impressive display of coordination on part of the Persean officers. The longer this battle goes on, the more clear that this isn't a fluke. It looks like the Persean League is going to take a very clean victory on this one. But it looks like the Nova's coming in for round 2. The Conquest is not nearby to help. It looks like the Griffin's going to have to take this one on its own. Will its shields hold against the powerful weaponry of the Nova? It looks like the answer is a clean yes. Here comes the Conquest in with the flanking maneuver, and the Nova goes down. That shield arc is powerful, but it's very limited. Novas are only scary when you have to fight them from the front, but when you attack them from multiple angles, they go down like a slaughtered beast. And that Vigilance is very bravely charging up to an Apex, a cruiser that is much more massive than itself. But it is being saved by the fighters here. It looks like mostly the fighters are taking those pulse laser shots, keeping the Vigilance nice and healthy, or about as healthy as it can be when it's already suffered severe damage. This Brilliant here is in a terrible position. It's flanked by both Conquests and a Griffin. Oh, that's unfortunate. It looks like the Vigilance off in the corner finally goes down. Lost but not forgotten, the crew of that Vigilance will go down in history as brave defenders of the human race against the automated threat. At this point, some of the smaller ships are hitting the limit of their peak performance per time, but I don't think it matters. This looks like the fight is a foregone conclusion. The remnants have lost. It's been a decisive victory for the Persean League. I'd expect nothing less from that pure Kazaronian steel of those ships. I'd once again like to thank Kazaron Shipyards not only for sponsoring this episode, but for providing assurance that in the end, it'll be humanity that stands victorious. And now it's time to turn you over to our analyst team for the after-action report. Did you like that? Was that fun? Did you enjoy that? The light show? Yeah, it was pretty good, wasn't it? Now you might be wondering what the whole deal with this video is. Well, it's simple. I had a very simple idea. What if Persean League fight Remnant? And that's it. Now, you might think, oh, well, you've done Midline versus Remnant before, but this is different. I mean Persean League. Everything. I'll put a little graphic on screen to show you, but I mean everything. The weapons, the fighters, even the commanding officer skills. So I'm only allowed coordinated maneuvers, crew training, officer training, and electronic warfare. I'm not allowed anything else. I went even as far as not to have a flagship. So no combat skills there either. I have to entirely rely on the officers and unofficered ships for that. No S-mods, nothing. In fact, all of the officers have to have steady personality because that's what Persean doctrine dictates. So on every level, this is a fleet that the Persean League could make. And on top of that, I gave very little orders during the battle, mostly letting the ships do what they want, aside from setting the Herons to escort the Griffins, and telling them which points to capture. Because obviously you do need to capture some of those points in order to fully deploy the fleet. So this is, theoretically, a fleet that the actual Persean League could build, and that they could launch. They just don't, because, they're not optimized the way that a player would. And the results, I think, were better than I expected. Considering these have no S-mods and very limited fleet-wide skills from the player's end, I would have expected things to go worse. Sure, the Remnant fleet itself was not that threatening. Only 89% bonus XP. But this is so bare bones in terms of what restrictions I had. I couldn't even put hypervelocity drivers on my conquests. I can't even put Devastators, because guess what? They only get Mjolnirs. That's their only large ballistic. So within the restrictions set by the Persean League, what builds did I throw at the enemy? Well, the first is the Conquest here. Without the Devastators on this side, I figured it would look a little too empty if theoretically, it would be better if I just left this side empty and relied entirely on one side and got some more hull mods. But I think they performed well enough, even if you don't do that. And man, it just doesn't look right having nothing on one side. It looks completely lopsided. So I'd rather do this. And the officer does have ordnance expertise, so those extra points being spent on those guns on the offside are at least contributing to some extra flux dissipation, which the ship needs, because normally you get flux regulation, and that would help you fire all of your guns. But guess what? We don't get that. We don't get flux regulation. And normally we'd get S-mods so we could afford a flux distributor. But we don't get that either. So the limitations here are pretty strict. And what I came up with was pretty simple. Linked Hydras. I think as far as the large missiles go, between the Dragonfire Torpedo Pod and the Hydra, I'm going to favor the Hydra. I think the longevity it provides is worth it compared to the damage of the Dragonfire Torpedo, especially when you have access to the medium Dragonfires. These give you the same weapon, but with lower ammo. Whereas the Hydras, they give you an entirely new weapon that can split, and it can take out enemy frigates at long range, as well as flank and get around the shield of something like a Nova. And that's a unique capability, on top of just having a lot of ammo, which means that the AI is going to fire it constantly. Unlike the Dragonfires, where it has to be more conservative with the ammo. I think that this combination overall worked best. I put a couple burst lasers up front. I'm not sure that's the best spot for them. I just put it there because the front is kind of an awkward spot for the Conquest. If they're on either side, it can just shoot at the enemy with their guns. But if they're in front of the Conquest, it can't exactly shoot back, so I figured that being the most vulnerable spot, I might as well put the point defense there. Maxing out the vents is a pretty obvious choice here, as well as stabilized shields, so it can actually have the flux to fire one side of its guns, if not both sides. Resistant flux conduits is also a really obvious choice, because the last thing you need is a salamander taking out your engines, so that EMP resistance is massive. Plus, the faster venting, combined with its incredibly high venting speed, means that while the shield's efficiency is pretty terrible, it can use active venting to get rid of all of that flux very quickly, which I have seen happen. I don't have expanded missile racks here because I found, for the duration of the fight we're looking at here, missile specialization is enough. It doesn't need the extra ammo for these Hydras. Maybe for the Dragonfires, but even then, it's a little conservative with the ammo, so it doesn't run out usually. So 30 points on missile racks is just too much. You can't fit it into the build. Instead, going like this seemed to work a lot better for the purposes of this little demonstration. Now, the funny thing with the Herons is that I did put officers in them, and I did only run 3 of them, which makes a lot of sense if you have the carrier skills, but again, the Persean League doesn't get the carrier skills. The commanding officer doesn't get those. So limiting myself like this doesn't actually make a lot of sense. Realistically speaking, what I should do is if I'm gonna run carriers, then I should just run no officers in the carriers instead of all of these vigilances. Instead of all of these, I could run like 5 Herons with no officers in them, and that would have no downside because I don't have the carrier skills. Now, if you wanted to use a similar fleet yourself, then running things this way would make more sense, because then you could use the carrier skills, but from a Persean perspective, it's a bit weird. But I figured I'd rather have a little bit of a showcase of a wider range of options instead of just spamming carriers and battlecruisers, which would be cool in its own right, but I digress. So luckily, as you can see here, the Persean League, with their limited selection of fighters, they do actually get a combination that's really good. The Talon Gladius Claw combination, which is crazy because they get those 3 fighters plus Thunders. And as we know, Thunders are like the more expensive version of the same thing you're looking at here. Like going Talon Gladius Claw is sort of like a more budget-friendly version of going Triple Thunder. In fact, I think this version has higher DPS on top of being cheaper. The difference is that Thunders are faster and have longer engagement range. In this case, I favored this combination, which it's very lucky that they actually get to combine them in this way. With the restrictions on fighters, I was worried that I would get some kind of combination and that like the tools that I would have to work with just wouldn't fit together. But somehow, the Persean League has the exact combination that I love to use and that I love to push onto people, to push and recommend, because this is a very solid combination. The Talons bringing the Vulcans and the Swarmers give them good hull DPS and a little bit of anti-armor. The Gladius bring flares that help increase the survivability of the Talons, which, their main weakness being how fragile they are, as well as some machine guns to help get through shields. And then the Claws, they bring some EMP because, the Talons and Gladius can kill frigates, sometimes destroyers, but they're not really going to kill cruisers or capitals. They just don't have enough damage for that. And so bringing in a 1 claw wing with those EMP means that at the very least they can pressure the enemy shield and then start disabling its weapons, even if they're not going to kill it. And of course, all of them have similar top speeds, which means that they're not slowing each other down. It's not like you have, say, this combined with a Warthog. A Talon and a Warthog would be a problem because the Talon would have to slow down a bunch to match the speed of the Warthog. In this case, they all have similar top speeds, so it's not really an issue. Now, I do want to correct something that I said in a past video where I said that the elite bonus of point defense didn't apply to fighters. I was wrong. I believed that for a long time. I believed that only the first part the non-elite effect applied to fighters. But it turns out the elite effect does too, which does make a noticeable difference, especially with the Vulcans and the machine guns being point defense weapons, getting a flat plus 200 range. That makes a noticeable difference in their performance. And then you throw in systems expertise for the officer to spam targeting feed more often, and the effectiveness is pretty nice. Now, you might wonder why I have missile specialization on this, and the reason for that is Persean League officers are forced to take missile specialization. That's the first skill that they take. Or at least that's how I understand it. So all of them have to have missile specialization, which is a bit awkward, but I was able to make it work. You know, throwing in a couple dragon fires here. They didn't use them too much, but when they did use them, it was effective. Not too much to complain about there. And I figured since I've got elite point defense to boost these fighters, I might as well also get some burst lasers and a targeting unit. Now, they're very fragile here, but of course, you set them to escort like another cruiser, and they're going to be in a fine position. Now, at the start of the battle, they try to auto-escort the conquests, which you really don't want, because escorting behavior for a broadside ship ends up being really weird. They want to sit behind the ship, but because it's a broadside ship, it ends up sideways, which means that the Heron ends up behind it, which ends up being way closer to the enemy than you really want it to be. And that's why I set them to escort the Griffins instead. And going back over here, forced to take missile specialization, I think the key is ballistic mastery and gunnery implants are the ones that I really want to put a lot of emphasis on. You know, the other stuff is there, like ordnance expertise, because I can't get flux regulation. Target analysis is just obvious. It needs to be able to kill cruisers and capitals. Combat endurance is just a straightforward damage bonus. The key, the real things here are ballistic mastery and gunnery implants, maximizing that range. Because as you saw during the battle, I had dev mode activated, which lets you zoom out a lot more than usual. And when you get that extra perspective, suddenly it becomes a lot clearer that the ships in this range have the ships in this game have pretty short range. Even with ballistic mastery and gunnery implants, it still feels a little short at times. It really needs that range to do its job effectively. And so I'm always going to recommend taking those skills on a conquest. Whereas over here, you know, you get combat endurance to max out the combat readiness, which not only affects the stats of the ship, but it also affects replacement rate. So maxing out combat readiness is a necessity for fighters. On top of that, I have expanded deck crew, which normally I wouldn't take for these, but the lack of carrier group as one of the skills means they do actually lose their replacement rate. So getting that expanded deck crew to help out a little bit is useful. And I've also got nav relays because while I do have coordinated maneuvers, all of my officers are in cruisers and capitals, all 8 of them, and that only contributes 1% per officer. That's a total of 8% nav rating, which is not great. So grabbing 3 nav relays on these cruisers, that's 4%, 4%, 4%, that's 12%, plus the 8% from coordinate maneuvers adds up to exactly 20%, the maximum. And getting that 20% nav rating is really good, because getting a fleet-wide 20% speed bonus, it's hard to understate how powerful that is. The Remnants have coordinated maneuvers. Part of what makes them so good is that they get that fleet-wide 20% movement speed bonus. And they get it very easily because pretty much all of their ships have AI cores, including all of their frigates. So yeah, that's about it for the Herons. For the Vigilance, I just decided the obvious choice would be monitors, because that is something that they can take, but I decided to go with something that I normally wouldn't take, and the Vigilance is not something I would normally take. In fact, I expected them to do a lot worse. But when you've got 8 of them, they do a lot better. I noticed a lot of the time that one Vigilance might be in a rough spot, but then it backs up and there's 2 other Vigilances to distract the enemy, so the Vigilance is able to get away. On top of that, the fighters did actually save the Vigilance sometimes, where a Vigilance might try to attack an enemy cruiser and it's getting pounded by pulse lasers, but it's got a bunch of fighters escorting it that absorb a lot of the shots, and so it's actually able to survive. As far as what I did with them, I would like to have advanced optics, but obviously couldn't quite afford that. You need to max out capacitors and get hardened shields if you want to give them a chance of surviving. I went with automated repair unit because I did see them getting hit by salamanders. They do lack point defense. And even with the Omni Shield, the last thing you want is for it to be pointing its shield backwards to stop a salamander when it's got an enemy in front of it. So I just decided give it an automated repair unit. You know, it also covers like ion arcs from ion beams, for example, as just to make sure that those engines stay online. And then giving it missile racks, because no officer means no missile specialization, which means it's going to run out pretty fast with those fast missile racks. I figure expanded missile racks are worth it. And I went with the Gorgon. Now, originally I was going to go with the Dragonfire. Just, you know, because why not, right? I have a bunch of these things spamming Dragonfires. But what I found is that they do actually have a good chance at killing enemy frigates if you just give them Gorgons. They do struggle a bit with, like, you know, the graviton beam here, but if you give them a Gorgon and you just let them spam missile racks, then they actually can fire off enough of these things to just kill an enemy remnant frigate, despite the fact that this ship has no officer and the remnant frigate has like an alpha core. If you fire enough Gorgons, it just wins. And then having the reason for the graviton beam is partly to keep up the soft flux pressure when you've got all these DEMs, but also partly because of the debuff it applies to enemy shields. If you've got 8 of these things floating around, then it's not too hard to get 3 of them to tag an enemy, like the shield of an enemy apex, which is then going to boost the damage of a conquest. So even though this thing's not doing a whole lot of damage, it's providing additional damage to your teammates. And I found this actually worked pretty well. Man, I can't wait for the Gorgons to get more ammo in the next patch, though. Right now, I still probably wouldn't want to use these in most cases, but once they get up to 16 ammo, the main downs, like comparing to harpoons fire 4 per volley, these only fire 2, so they're going to have less like smaller bursts of damage, but in exchange they have more ammo, which is going to make them perfect for the Vigilance because it uses fast missile racks to bypass the shorter rate of fire and the shorter bursts. So the Persean League is actually going to have a good reason to be using these DEMs instead of harpoons on their Vigilance. They're going to have a good reason to do that. It's like actually going to synergize there, and I think that's pretty cool. But I did not apply the buff here. I'm still using the 12 ammo. On the other hand, something I did apply was the nerf to the Griffin. I removed expanded missile racks, and you could see by the end of that battle, they were running out of Dragonfires. I think they only had Hydras left at that point. So removing that did matter. And I've mostly avoided using the Griffin in other videos, because the obvious thing to do is to just put on a Squall, put on some harpoons, and it's going to do insane DPS. But with the restriction of only using Persean League weapons, I thought it would be a little more fair to bring it in, especially when I'm forced to use missile specialization as a skill. And for this purpose, max out capacitors, get hardened shields, targeting unit, and ECCM package. It's pretty obvious. The extra points to spend on missile racks, not as worth it, because 20 is a lot, but on top of that, when you factor in missile autoforge and missile specialization, it already has 4 times the baseline ammo. Adding in missile racks would only get it up to 5 times. That's a 25% increase. So, like, missile racks is priced assuming you don't have any ammo bonuses. Because if you take a ship like a Kite and you throw it on, that's on a 100% ammo increase. But when you've got a ship that's already got missile autoforge and missile specialization, well, now suddenly the proportional extra ammo you're getting is a lot smaller. Instead of it being 100%, you're only getting 25%. For 20 ordnance points, not really worth it. You can see here I grabbed ordnance expertise so that they could actually afford to fire their heavy autocannon. I'd love to put a hypervelocity driver there, but that's just not an option. It needs some kind of kinetic weapon. Well, it doesn't really need it, I guess, but I do want some kind of kinetic weapon to at least pressure the enemy shields a little bit without completely relying on ammo. But the interesting thing with this ship is mostly going to be the fire groups. I moved all of the Gorgons into the same fire group as the Hydra. While the Hydra does have a lot longer range, the problem with the Gorgons is that they just weren't firing them. They just refused to fire them a lot of the time, even when it was in range. So by linking them all to the Hydra, it forces them to fire at the same time. Sometimes it's going to fire at a target, and the Gorgons are just not going to reach because they only have 1500 range, compared to the Hydra's 2500. But most of the time it's not an issue, because it does want to get in range to use the heavy autocannon, and at that point, it's close enough to use everything. The other thing I did is I linked the 2 Dragonfires together, just because if it's firing a torpedo to kill something, firing 2 is probably better, right? Rather than letting the AI try and calculate if it wants to use 1 or 2. Sometimes it makes a lot of mistakes with that. I would rather just force it to fire both. And that seemed to work pretty well. So that's about it. See ya.